The man at the doorstep came for my father when he turned 37. I was 10 years old at the time. It started with a single knock at the door in the middle of the night. Knock, followed by another. Knock, and so on. I heard the sounds first, and eventually so did my dad. I remember hearing him step out of my parents' bedroom in the dark and stop in the hallway as he listened, while the knocking continued. Knock, over, knock, and over, knock, and over, until he finally went downstairs and opened the door, and by the time I made it to the staircase to see who it was, my dad was already gone, our front door slamming behind him. Not long after, his disappearance was ruled a missing persons case, the leading theory being that he suffered from depression and just decided to wake up one night, wander off into the night, and end his own life. But I knew the truth. I knew what had really happened to him. I had heard the man at the doorstep. Unfortunately, no matter how many times I tried to explain what I had heard, no one believed me. Not the cops, not my mom, and not even my friends. So as I grew up, I began to doubt myself, doubt my memory, doubt my ability to separate my childhood imagination from reality. And I eventually resolved to buy into the suicide theory that the police had proposed. That is, until one day at the age of 37, the man at the doorstep returned. It started with a single knock at the door in the middle of the night. Knock, followed by another. Knock, and so on. Being the sole occupant of the house handed down to me from my mother, and a single one at that, I was the only one to hear the sound. I stepped out of what was now my bedroom, and formerly my parents' bedroom, in the dark, and stopped in the hallway as I listened, while the knocking continued. Knock, over, knock, and over, knock, and over, until I finally went downstairs. But unlike my father, I didn't open the door. I simply tiptoed up to it and looked through the peephole. Sure enough, on the other side of the door was the silhouette of a hooded man, knocking away, over, knock, and over, knock, and over. But knowing the fate that had befallen my father, there was no way I was going to answer him. So I just tiptoed over to the staircase, took a seat on one of the steps. Knock. I waited, and waited. Knock, and waited for him to stop. Knock, but he never did. Minutes turned to hours, and before I knew it, the sun began to rise. That's when the knocking stopped, and the man at the doorstep simply walked away. The next day was business as usual as I went about another hectic workday, and almost forgot what had happened the night before, eventually chalking it up to a nightmare. But later that night, after I went to bed, I woke to the chilling sound of a single knock at the door. Knock, followed by another. Knock, and so on. Once again, I tiptoed downstairs, looked through the peephole, and saw the same shadowy silhouette of a hooded figure knocking away at the door. Knowing that this was no dream, I went to the kitchen, grabbed a steak knife, and tiptoed over to the staircase, where I took a seat on one of the steps. Knock. I waited. Knock, and waited. Knock, and waited for him to stop, but he never did. Once again, minutes turned to hours, and before I knew it, it was 5 a.m. But sunrise was still an hour away, and I found myself beginning to lose it as I grew increasingly disturbed with every knock, single, knock, tap at the door, until eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. And rather than calling the police or hopping out a window and running away, I worked up the courage to face my fears and opened the door. The hooded figure said nothing. He simply turned around and started walking away before turning back and gesturing for me to follow him. Still holding the steak knife, I felt compelled to do as he asked. And a few minutes later, I found myself following him into the darkness of the forest behind my house, the only light that of the moon shining through the trees. He didn't turn around once. He just kept walking, and walking, and walking, while I followed behind him, my sweaty hands struggling to keep a solid grip on the steak knife. And after walking for what must have been 10 minutes in the dark, he eventually took a seat by a smoldering fire and gestured for me to sit next to him. That's when he removed his hood and revealed a familiar face. That of my father. Dad? Isaac. Where have you been? And what were you doing at the house? Where? Waiting. What? Knocking. But why? It's time you knew the secret. Secret? We have something of a tradition in this family. What kind of tradition? But by the time I finished my question, I had already started to piece everything together. If the man at the doorstep took my father at the age of 37, and my father is now the man at the doorstep, and I'm at the age of 37. You're next in line, he said. But then what became of the last man at the doorstep, who I began to realize must have been my grandfather, I wondered. I'm glad you brought the blade, he said, looking at the steak knife that I'd brought from the kitchen. It's as if you knew. Knew? That you must kill me and take over my watch until your own child turns 37. But I don't have a child. Yet. Dad, I'm not gonna hurt you. The tradition states that if you do not, I must kill you instead and end our bloodline once and for all. You. Kill. Me. Your son. Dad, I haven't been your father in 27 years. I'm something else now. That's when he pulled out a knife of his own. I stood up, my body shaking, as he did the same. Don't make me do it. Just tell me you'll kill me, and I'll explain everything before you do, he insisted. Of course, I didn't have the will to do as he asked, so instead I made a run for it, back through the dark forest, under the light of the moon as it shone through the trees. But his legs were longer than mine, and in no time, he had caught up to me and cornered me against a tree. You can still save yourself. Just say it, Isaac. Say that you'll kill me. Never, I said defiantly, tossing my steak knife down to the ground. Then so it must be, he said, without any emotion, as he walked over and swung at me with his own knife. I caught his arm before his blade could wound me, and wrestling with him in the dark of night, somehow managed to push him back with all my might. He must have tripped on some of the forest's underbrush, and the next thing I knew, he had impaled himself on the very steak knife I had thrown away in an attempt to avoid hurting him. Nicely done. It is your turn now, he said, looking down at his blade as blood poured from his mouth, and his eyes rolled back in his head. Dad, no, I cried out, but it was too late. It took me years to get over the experience, and even longer to even remotely consider having a child of my own. But eventually, when enough time had passed, I got married and had a baby boy. And while I would never ever do anything to harm him, every once in a while I wonder if, when he turns 37, I might feel compelled to stand at his door and knock over, and over, and over, until he finally goes downstairs and opens the door